How is everybody doing? Welcome to the Strategy Room. This is Saturday night, April 26th, 2025. It is great to be back. It's been a couple weeks. A lot of crazy stuff happening in the world, but I hope everybody is doing good out there. I want everybody to strap in. We got a great show for everyone tonight. We're going to be going through a lot of stuff. We're going to be kicking it off in just a minute here with a very interesting Doge conversation here tonight. I'm going to be showing you guys a few things there, and we're going to be talking about maybe it's working and maybe not working so well. We'll get into that in a minute, but got some economic indicators coming up later in the show. We're going to talk a lot about the consumer tonight. How is the consumer feeling? Consumer sentiment numbers aren't looking so hot, and yet consumer spending just marshals right on along. We're actually seeing an increase in consumer spending. We're actually seeing an increase in the purchase of big ticket items. But everything is not rosy. There are also a lot of concerns amongst banks with credit card, particularly their credit card holdings right now and how the consumer is holding up with that. So again, we're going to have a whole conversation based around that a little bit later on in the evening. I've got a ton of banking news, finance related news to come up as we go through here. Some really interesting things as we go on tonight. But for a first thing, I just wanted to say, over the last 2 weeks, we had a couple of very interesting 250-year anniversary. We had the anniversary of Paul Revere running through Boston, basically, with the British are coming, the British are coming. We also had the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord, the first little skirmishes of the War for Independence and the shot heard around the world. So really fascinating stuff. I'm a huge history buff. I love studying the history of not only the United States, but world history, but all different kinds of aspects of history, economic history, warfare history, national history, just a lot of different types of stuff out there. So I love to point this stuff out because I think it is hugely important. I think it is critical to understand. If you want to understand finance, you got to understand the founding of the country. You got to understand why that happened. A lot of the consternation, if you will, that happened back then in those days was because George Washington, Sam Adams, John Hancock, a lot of these guys were businessmen. They were businessmen. And a big reason why the revolution happened was because they could not conduct business. They couldn't run their businesses the way they wanted to. They couldn't operate things. It cost them a fortune. There's, a story about how if you wanted certain things, you had to literally get on a boat. You had to go across the Atlantic, and you had to go before the king or the king's representatives, but you had to do it in a very certain way. You had to have this stagecoach, and you had to dress a certain way, and you had to exemplify kind of like wealth, and be part of the establishment, so to speak. And it was insanely expensive to do this. So very, very few people could. George Washington, coincidentally, was one of the few people that could actually do this. And he, went on behalf of not only himself, but a number of other business owners in America, basically trying to lobby the crown to, hey, make it a little bit easier for us to do this. We want to supply you with that. Can you help us out here a little bit? And Britain they just were brutal. They were brutal, and it really cracked down. And that's really what a lot of this came from. So if you understand the business or the economic aspects of what happened during the Revolutionary War, you begin to understand a big part of why that happened and why that carries into today. And then you get into the founding of the country, and you get into Alexander Hamilton and the creation of the first central bank in the United States, which was called the First Bank of the United States. And then you also get into why the first two central banks were, their charters were not renewed, and they were basically put out to pasture, and why we went, I forget the exact number of years, but I don't know, 75 years, 80 years without a central bank until the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. So I just think that, a lot of the history in the country, it should be celebrated. and it needs to be understood. If you're going to understand finance and economics, you have to understand the history of the country. In order to understand where we're going, you got to know where we've been. So like I said, so I just wanted to point that out. I thought it was some really interesting things I like to see. But I'll tell you what. With that being said, let's jump into a couple things here. We're going to come back to that in just a second. Let's take a look. Let's start off here. Let's take a look at our U.S. debt clock and see, how are we doing here? How are our people at Doge doing? So Doge has apparently saved the U.S. citizen, U.S. taxpayer, if you will, $363 billion and counting. And the savings per taxpayer is now up to $3,235. And that's up here in the left-hand corner of our U.S. debt clock website here that we can see. Haven't really made any progress in terms of national debt, in terms of the U.S. budget deficit. National debt's approaching $37 trillion. Our annual fiscal deficit is still over $2 trillion. I happen to think by the end of the year, this number is probably going to come in somewhere around 2.3, 2.4 trillion at the end of the government's fiscal year, which is September 30th. So, but we'll see. But a lot of interesting things happening this week with Doge. Has Elon Musk basically thrown in the towel? Elon talked a lot about for the last couple of months about wanting to get to $1 trillion in cuts. If you've watched any of the past episodes, I've said that I would love to see that, but I really wasn't sure if that was going to be a reality or if that could really come to fruition. And it's looking like with the way things are going that's not going to happen, that they're not going to get there. And I think a lot of people, again, we're looking at this number right here of this $363 billion. And I think a lot of people would dispute that they've actually created that much savings. So let's take a look at a couple of articles here real quick. So Elon Musk is stepping back from Doge. How much has it saved the government? So Elon Musk on Tuesday said he would spend less time as President Donald Trump's cost-cutting advisor. During the first 3 months of Trump's administration, the Musk-led Department of Government Efficiency claims to have saved $160 billion. Some dispute that figure. Those cuts are below Musk's goals and only a small portion of the federal budget, totaling $6.8 trillion last year. Elon Musk aimed to take a big bite out of federal spending. His cost-cutting task force has managed only a nibble as the billionaire takes a step back from his White House role. Musk on Tuesday said he would spend less time at the Department of Government Efficiency, or Doge, and more time at his job as Tesla CEO. That doesn't mean the team's work is done. Musk characterized the team as in place and working in the government, or that he won't be involved, but some change is on the way. Starting next month, I'll be allocating far more of my time to Tesla now that the major work of establishing the Doge is done, Musk said, adding that he would likely continue to spend a day or two a week on government work. The news, nevertheless, is an opportunity to measure Doge's work so far. According to the Doge website, Musk's team has saved the government $160 billion by canceling contracts and leases and laying off employees, or 8% of Musk's original goal of cutting the federal budget by $2 trillion. And 16% of the $1 trillion goal Musk set when President Donald Trump took office. So, and then here's a very interesting chart here. It says Doge takes tiny chainsaw to federal budget. So again, here's the federal budget, $6.8 trillion. Musk's original target was $2 trillion. The revised target was $1 trillion. And we're basically looking at about $160 billion in savings so far. And like I said, and that is much smaller than this debt clock number we have here of $363 billion. So now here they're only talking about 160 billion. So questions remain about Doge's calculations. Several investigations have disputed the actual savings so far. The task force, meanwhile, has repeatedly rolled back savings figures that proved erroneous. And then it gets into New York Times said, oh, we only found this, whatever. And that was pretty much the end of it. Now, I want to show you guys a very interesting article here that I saw in the Epoch Times, and this is called 9 Charts to Put Doge Efforts in Perspective. An overview of government spending tends to lend a perspective on the work of the Department of Government Efficiency. So here we have some really interesting charts here. So we'll start over here on the left. So percentage increase, spending versus earnings. You can see here federal spending way up, GDP increasing, but median household income, not really doing so hot here the last 5 years, but even not doing so hot, even going back to 20 years before that. Federal workforce under President Clinton. So here we go, like 93 to 2001. So you can see that the millions of employees, this is NAFTA taking hold, sending all of our manufacturing jobs overseas. So you can see the number of millions of employees. You can see that number just plunging down. And then, 2000, we had a spike up there because we had the recession. If you remember, we had the dot-com bubble burst at that point. And then he had 9/11. And so we had, a spike in government spending. So, employment shoots up, but then it comes crashing right back down here. Federal workforce, 2019 through 2024. So again, this is 2020 through 2024. We could see here the number here at 2020 was about 285. And then we jump up here to 315. And this is millions of employees. And then it comes, really as fast as it goes up, it comes plunging back down. And then it kind of hits a lull for 2 years, but then plunges back down. But then we see here at beginning at kind of the end of 2022, we just see this spike right back up here, about another 15 million or so. So again, very interesting. Now let's go over to the far right here. Federal spending by category, 2019 versus 2024. 55% overall increase, and this is billions of dollars. So you can see Social Security spending way up, Medicare spending way up, Medicaid spending way up, other non-defense, defense up, everything's up. Interest on the national debt. Look at that one. The interest on the national debt. So you're spending about $1 trillion every year just to cover that national debt. That's just pretty amazing. And it is absolutely unsustainable. We cannot continue to spend that much money just to cover the national debt. Again, this is a big reason why, Trump is looking to cut interest rates. He's looking to get interest rates down because we're spending almost $1 trillion on the interest just to service the national debt. Okay, let's look at a couple of these other charts here. So growth in revenue and debt, 2019 through 2024. So revenue growth, 1.5 trillion, debt growth, 12.8 trillion. So let me say that again. Revenue growth, 1.5 trillion, debt growth, $12.8 trillion. So you can see here, federal revenue. And again, this is 2019 versus 2024. So you can see federal revenue only up a little bit. Federal debt has just spiked massively. And then, Doge savings versus federal borrowing and spending. So Doge savings year to date says 150 billion. U.S. borrowing per month, 151.7 billion. And then U.S. spending per month, $566 billion. That's spending per month. It's crazy. And then let's look at this workforce reduction by type. So layoff, 0.2%. Other separation, 46.3%. And then deferred resignation, 53.6%. So when you look at the layoffs here, the majority, 53%, almost 54%, were basically deferred resignations, meaning they basically took retirement packages, things of that nature. Then you had other separations, but the actual layoffs are pretty much a small percentage, which I think is very interesting, because I think a lot of people wouldn't have looked at it that way. Then we have here the 2024 federal spending versus the Doge reductions. So again, 6.8 trillion and Doge reductions, we're only talking about $150 billion there. So only a tiny fraction. And then finally, we get to this bigger chart here at the top here, staff reduction by agency. So positions remaining, positions reduced. So you can see here in the Defense Department, only a tiny fraction. Veterans Affairs, tiny fraction. Homeland Security, basically nothing. Independent agencies, again, a tiny fraction. Agriculture gets a little bit bigger. 82,000 here. Positions remaining. And then Health and Human Services, again, a little bit. Treasury, now Treasury has seen a pretty significant, staff reduction there, 27,000 people there over at the Treasury. The Interior, again, not so much. Transportation, not so much. Commerce, not so much. Now, the State Department, you've seen a 10,000 layoff. Labor Department, not much anything. Department of Energy, a little bit. Housing and Urban Development, a little bit. And then Department of Education, you've had, 1,529 people so far. So again, I think this paints a very interesting picture in terms of the layoffs. Like you could see here of all the different parts of the government, the three areas that have been affected the most so far are the Treasury, the State Department, and the Department of Education. Those are the three basically areas that have been hit the largest on a percentage basis thus far. So again, it's very interesting. So most of the other areas, whether you're talking about defense, veteran affairs, homeland security, transportation, haven't really seen a whole ton of layoffs there. And if we go back to this chart here, again, the majority of this is deferred, resignation, like basically people that took the retirement packages. So again, I just thought that I wanted to share this with everybody. I saw these charts. I thought they were really interesting. I thought it relayed a lot of really good information. It really explained a lot of what's going on with Doge right now and how they're having effect or not having an effect, basically on everything that's going on. So again, I do find this some of this very disheartening. I really had very high hopes for Doge. I really hoped that they were going to get in here, and maybe they still might. But I think the reality is, with Elon Musk stepping back from this thing, unless somebody else that's over there at Doge, unless somebody I think steps forward to really become the point person on this, to really continue to drive this new government department, or I don't know. I just I don't want I really don't want to say yet that this thing's going to be a flop, but it's beginning to look like this is going to be a flop. Like it's going to be a big dud that ultimately didn't get us anywhere. And it's sad, because if you looked at a lot of the interviews that Elon's done, particularly over the last month or two, he basically talks about how, and I remember in the one interview, he vividly said that, like, yeah, if I keep going with this, I'm probably going to get killed, because, because basically, you're messing with somebody's wallet. That's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. When you're cutting these departments, when you're trying to reduce the size of the government, you got a lot of government contractors, you got lobbyists, you've got this whole machine that operates in and around the government. And, they don't like this. They don't like this. This is the loss of jobs. This is the loss of income. This is the loss of wealth. Like this, they don't like this. They're going to fight back on this with everything they've got. And it's no coincidence that, Elon has done this, and his Tesla has been attacked the way that it has. And, and I find it very troubling, and I think it's crazy that this is happening. But that's, this is where we're at. So it's interesting that, again, the debt clock here is showing that Doge has saved us $363 billion, yet a lot of other places are reporting that no, that number is actually only $150 or $160 billion. And even that savings is being, called into question. So, I think that leaves a lot of like, well, where are we really at? How much money have they really saved us? And unfortunately, I think the thought of, Doge getting in and being able to cut $1 trillion or find $1 trillion worth of fraud, waste, and abuse in the government, that looks like it's evaporating very quickly. To make matters worse, what I have been saying for months now is that, Congress is not serious about actually making real cuts. They're not serious about dramatically reducing the federal deficit or our national debt. Like they're just not, they're not interested in that. The other Republicans came out and basically said, hey, we're going to cut we cut 1.5 trillion from the budget, and you look at that, but then you had to read the fine print. And the fine print said, oh yeah, they cut 1.5 trillion over 10 years. So when you divide that out over 10 years, you're only talking about, 200 billion plus dollars a year that you're cutting. I mean, it's a joke. I mean, you got a $2 trillion federal deficit, and you're talking about cutting a couple $100 billion a year. I mean, that's nothing. You got what do we have right here? We have, if we go back to this chart right here, $6.8 trillion in federal spending. 6.8 trillion on an annual basis. And they're talking about cutting, $200 billion. I mean, it'd be sad if it wasn't a joke. I mean, it's just crazy that this is what's going on. And yes, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. But I find it very disheartening. And I know that, if we don't do something about this now, if we don't do something very serious, we don't take some very serious steps in addressing this, this is going to lead to some very, very bad consequences down the road. That's what I do know. And nobody in this country is going to be happy about where this ends up at the end of the day if this does not get fixed in a serious way. And we have, and again, the government has a very short period of time to address this stuff. They don't, Trump's in office for 4 years, but he doesn't have 4 years to get this done. He's probably got about 18 months to make something happen here. And if he can't make it happen in 18 months, maybe the Republicans lose the House, and then that might be all she wrote, because then the Democrats are just going to dive bomb his agenda the rest of the time. And then, everybody's going to be looking to the 2028 election to see what can happen. So, so again, there it is. But again, I'll continue to monitor Doge. I'll continue to see what happens there. My hope is that maybe there's somebody else on the team there that is kind of willing to pick up the ball here, so to speak, and run with it and make something happen. But we'll see. But let's go. So let's take a look at some other things here. Now, this is a really interesting article here. How long will big U.S. banks continue to lead the world? And I want everybody to dwell on this for a minute, because we're going to go through some other stuff. And then later on tonight, we're going to come back to this. Now, again, when I say later on tonight, I mean in about 4 hours, right? Everybody's cool with hanging out for like 4 hours, right? No, I'm not going to make everybody wait that long. So, but this basically says, the trade war threatens the global dominance and growth of America's mega banks. So what is interesting is that this first line says it all. America is the China of banking. Like America American banks have this dominance in banking around the world. Like we dominate the banking and finance sector around the world. And it's because of our big four. It's because of JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citibank. And those four, major banks in the U.S., like I said, they dominate finance around the world. And it's very interesting. We could get into a very deep philosophical discussion about, the whole too big to fail, should these banks be broken up and stuff like that. But there is also a geopolitical and a national security aspects of this to think about. Do we want America to be the dominant financial player around the world? Do we want U.S. banks to be the dominant U.S. banks around the world? I think the answer to that is yes. So, again, we have to kind of live with too big to fail, because we want these guys to be the big players, because if they're not, then China is, and that's not where we want things to be. But like I said, I just want to let this sit and stew for a little bit. Okay, we're gonna come back to this, because I think it's important to run through some of these other news articles and some of the other topics that we're going to talk about tonight, and then we'll come back to how long will big U.S. banks continue to lead the world. We'll just keep like I said, dwell on that for a minute. Okay, so this article blew my mind this week. So who is the economy really working for here? So this is from the Wall Street Journal. 1 trillion of wealth was created for the 19 richest U.S. households last year. $1 trillion. that is just staggering. Share of U.S. household wealth held by the top 1%. Back in the third quarter of 1990, it was 8.5%. As of the fourth quarter of 2024, that is up to 13.8%, which is just astronomical. So the 19 richest U.S. households saw a $1 trillion wealth increase in 2024, a rise that exceeds the size of Switzerland's economy. The top 1%'s share of U.S. household wealth jumped to 1.8% in 2024 after a record increase. The number of U.S. billionaires neared 2,000 last year, up from about 1,400 in 2021 by one estimate. So we have increased by almost 600 billionaires in the last 4 years, which is extraordinary. Now that on the one hand, that might sound great. It's like, oh, well, that's great. Wealth is increasing. We're creating all these new billionaires. Yes, but the money is concentrating at the very top of the pyramid, and where's everybody else? So so basically the top 1% are doing fantastic. The last 5 years have been amazing for them. They've seen this giant bonanza in wealth, but the bottom 50% of the country, ain't not doing so hot. So this, and again, I mean, this just kind of, when I saw this earlier this week, when I saw this article, it blew my mind, because you have to look at this for a second. 1 trillion of wealth was created for the 19 richest U.S. households last year. The richest of the rich in America control record slice of nation's wealth. I mean, it's just astonishing. How much money the top 1% in this country has. It's crazy. And this goes on to say, let's see here. So the wealthiest have gotten richer and control a record share of America's wealth. New data suggests 1 trillion of wealth was created for the 19 richest American households alone in 2024. That is more than the value of Switzerland's entire economy. It took 4 decades for the top 1% of America's share of total U.S. household wealth to grow from 1% in 1982, when 11 households made up that rarefied group, to 1.2% in 2023. According to analysis by Gabriel Zuckman, an economist at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Paris School of Economics. In 1 year, by the end of 2024, the share of total U.S. household wealth for the modern 1%, those 19 households, jumped to 1.8%, or about 2.6 trillion. That is the biggest one-year increase on record, according to Zuckman. And then you look at this chart, and 1913, the year the Fed was created, you had basically 0.85%. And then obviously 1920, you get, and then of course, why it's going down, because obviously you get the stock market crash in 1929, you get the Great Depression, you get World War II, you get all that in here. But then, starting right here about the early 1980s, we really see this run up, and then we get this run up to 2000. Then we have the dot-com bubble burst. And then you have then it pops up a little bit here, and then you have the Great Recession, 08, 09, then it plunges back down. But then ever since 09, you have seen this thing skyrocket back up here. Just amazing. Total U.S. household wealth stood at about $148 trillion at the end of 2024. According to a measure Zuckman used that subtracts the value of big ticket items such as appliances, as well as unfunded pensions, from the Federal Reserve's estimate of household wealth, the average net worth of all groups has climbed since the third quarter of 1990 as the U.S. economy has grown. The growth in wealth of the richest Americans has far outpaced that of all other U.S. wealth groups. Yes, exactly. And then we see here, like, number of U.S. billionaires in 2021, 1,370, 2022, 1,540, 2023, 1,730, and then 2024, 1,990, plus 45% since 2021. I mean, it's, just crazy. Wealth managers say the surging stock market in 2024 supercharged wealth creation at the top, following already sizable gains the prior year. Together, those 2 years made for the S&P 500's best consecutive years in a quarter century. Markets have fallen since President Trump unleashed a global trade war. dramatizing the volatile nature of wealth for the richest of the rich. With much of their wealth tied up in the stock market, their net worth can swing by billions daily. Oh, the horror. And then we have some more interesting charts here. I'm not going to get totally into all this stuff here, but again, it just shows you, what's happening here. So, is it any wonder why, the president's agenda gets a lot of pushback on? Because, again, the people at the top of the pyramid, they are happy as a pig in what right now, because they're making a ton of money. But the people at the bottom, again, like you said, aren't doing so hot. And so this, and this disparity of wealth, again, this is not something that continue. Just as I talk about this ginormous, the 36 trillion in national debt, the $2 trillion in deficit spending, this disparity and income equality, like this cannot continue this pace either. Because this too, history tells us, history seems to be the theme tonight. History tells us that if this continues, this takes us to a very bad place. This takes us to a very bad place. History has shown time and time again that when, the top 1%, top 5% of your economy, the consumers in the country, when they start to get X amount of percentage of the wealth in the country, and you get this big disparity in income inequality, it doesn't lead to good places. So this is not a good thing. And I think that at this point, the amount of wealth creation at the top is it's staggering. It's just, you can't comprehend these. We talk about $1 trillion, but can you really comprehend $1 trillion at the end of the day? That's the issue of what is going on here. So, but anyway, now let's jump into the Fed. Let's talk about some Fed stuff here for a little bit. So the European Central Bank, they cut rates as trade tensions weigh on outlook, inflation eases. So facing softer inflation and rising risks to the economic outlook, the ECB has cut rates and called on governments to pursue reforms. So that's fascinating. So it must be nice. If you're in Europe right now, it must be very nice to have a central bank that's actually cutting rates and trying to help you out. That must be wonderful to have that. I wish we had that here in the U.S. But I guess we all can't be that lucky, right? So, but the European Central Bank has cut interest rates by 25 basis points, citing easing inflation and rising downside risks to economic growth, including escalating global trade tensions and weakening business confidence across the euro market. What I pose you a question out there, good listener. Are we not seeing slightly easing inflation? Are we not seeing rising downside risks to economic growth? Are we not seeing the escalating global trade tensions? Are we not seeing a weakening in business confidence across the United States? Are we not seeing all those same things? Yes, we are. And yet their central bank seems to have no problem cutting rates, while our central bank, Jeremy Powell, is just sitting there and, I've said it before, Jeremy Powell has taken his ball and he's gone home. He's basically like, forget it. I'm not doing nothing for you guys. And that's that. But I wanted to point this out here to let everybody else know that, hey, look, there's a lot going on in the world, especially in the world of finance. And, we've got other central banks around the world cutting rates. And, and where are we at? What are we doing? And then also here, this was big news this week. So sorry about that for a second. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So the IMF slashes the 2025 U.S. growth forecast to 1.8% from 2.7%, citing trade tensions. So the International Monetary Fund lowered its 2025 projections for U.S. growth to 1.8%, reflecting a cut of 0.9 percentage points from the forecast it delivered in January. The April 2nd Rose Garden announcement forced us to jettison our projections, nearly finalized at that point, and compress a production cycle that usually takes more than 2 months into less than 10 days, said the IMF's chief economist, Pierre-Olivier Grinchas. The Grinch. Because that's basically what that forecast is. He's the Grinch. Tariffs are posing major headwinds. Of course, yes, we know this. In its new projections, the IMF now calls for the U.S. growth outlook of 1.8% in 2025, down 0.9 percentage points from its January forecast. So they're saying that, hey, things aren't going to look so rosy in the U.S. So again, I don't think any of this is shocking. I think, hey, it is what it is for the moment. And we'll keep this one on ice for just a second as we continue on here. So now, Jeremy Powell, April 16th, last week, Fed Chair Powell emphasizes inflation risks of Trump trade war. So Jeremy Powell is all on this kick that the tariffs are going to create all this massive inflation, and he's using that as his excuse right now for why he can't cut interest rates. I just can't do anything. Trump wanted to move forward with all these tariffs, and it's a horrible thing, and he's going to wreck the economy, and so therefore, I just have to sit here and do nothing. I can't step in. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to step in and do anything right now. So Federal Reserve Chairman Jeremy Powell expects Donald Trump's tariffs campaign to push inflation, the central banker said in a Wednesday speech. Powell emphasized the inflation risks and said the Fed would not necessarily step in to help financial markets with lower interest rates if stocks plummeted. Okay, the tariffs threaten to slow the economy while pushing up inflation, putting the Fed in a difficult position since its monetary policy tools can only help with one of those problems at a time. And again, there's two things going on here. Number one is this is a perfect example of the financial news media running cover for the Fed. Jeremy Powell basically says, "Forget it. I'm taking my ball. I'm going home. I don't care if I don't care if the economy burns." Okay, I want you to read this here for a second. If you think my if you think my comments are a little bit too out there or a little bit too harsh, not hyperbolic. I forget. I can't think of the word right this second, but basically embellishing. Am I embellishing upon the situation? So I point you back to this again. Powell emphasizes the inflation risks and said the Fed would not necessarily step in to help financial markets with lower interest rates if stocks plummeted. Okay, so that's telling you right there, that's signaling to you right there that he is fine with letting the economy burn just to spite Trump. That's where we're at. I mean, it's pretty wild that that's where we're at, but that's where we're at. The Federal Reserve appears to be bracing for a fresh surge of inflation from President Donald Trump's campaign of tariffs. So, but I ask you this, 2 weeks ago, we looked at some of the inflation data and we basically said, oh, we're starting to see a pattern of inflation easing up and coming down. So I propose this question. This coming week, we are going to get some fresh inflation data. If that inflation data shows that the inflation is coming down, how much longer is this argument from Jeremy Powell going to hold water? How much longer is basically he going to be able to, is he going to get away with this? And is the financial media going to play cover for him? Okay. And, so it's a very kind of infuriating thing right now that Jeremy Powell, and like I said, he has more tools in his toolbox than just interest rates. There are a number of things that he could do to try to at least help with the situation. And like I said, he is basically saying to us that he is doing nothing. He's not going to do nothing. And what's even worse is that the media is going to play cover for him and basically say, yeah, we agree that it's fine that Powell does nothing and sits on the sidelines over here and doesn't do anything. Which again is amazing. So, but let's continue on here. So Fed's hammock calls for patience in assessing what impacts tariffs will have on the economy. So in her first broadcast interview since taking the reins at the Cleveland Fed, Hammock noted the high level of uncertainty now and did not commit to a specific course of action regarding interest rates. A former Goldman Sachs executive, Hammock said she is sensitive to market movements, but only in how they affect broader economic conditions. So Cleveland Fed President Beth Hammock said Thursday she thinks policymakers need to be patient rather than preemptive in assessing how tariffs will impact inflation and growth. In her first broadcast interview since taking the reins at the central bank district in August of 2024, Hammack noted the high level of uncertainty now and did not commit to a specific course of action regarding interest rate policy. I think we need to be patient. I think this is a time when we want to make sure we're moving in the right direction than moving too quickly in the wrong direction, she told CNBC's Squawk Box. So I would rather take our time to make sure we're looking at the data, the hard data, which are actually really good. Hammack's remarks come at a sensitive time for the Federal Reserve, which had been left to assess the impact of President Donald Trump's tariffs on both inflation and the employment. Several central bank officials, including Chair Jeremy Powell, have said the duties pose threats to both sides of the Fed's dual mandate, posing another challenge on how to calibrate monetary policy. Hammack also voiced concerns over how the Fed might balance those priorities. It could be that we have the two sides of our mandate and conflict, which is the most challenging for monetary policy, she said. If it's higher inflation, lower employment, that's where things get really complicated. Again, they go, I love how that's basically stagflation. And I love how nobody wanted to talk about stagflation a couple of years ago, okay, when that's basically what we had and where we were going. And, they just nobody wanted to talk about it. But now all of a sudden it's become, just in the last couple of months, it's become this in vogue thing. Okay, now we're going to talk about stagflation. Stagflation could happen. If stagflation happens, then, we just can't do it. And everything with these guys right now is an if. If this happens, then, we couldn't possibly do anything. If that happens, we couldn't possibly do anything. Well, you guys have a lot of data over there at the Fed. The Fed's got all these, they're supposed to have all these brilliant geniuses over there with all these PhDs from, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and everywhere under the sun. And yet these guys can't seem to look at the data like everybody else and figure out a course of action, which is just absolutely amazing to me. If you could tell, I don't give these guys an easy pass. All right, let's go on here. So, and this is kind of a little out of step here with some of the other articles and stuff that we're looking at the moment, but it is rather important Fed news. So I just wanted to point it out. So Philadelphia's Fed taps President Patrick Harker's successor. So Patrick Harker is the head of the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. He is stepping down. There is Mr. Patrick Harker right there. Anna Paulson has been appointed as new president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Paulson will represent the 3rd District on the Federal Open Market Committee. She will oversee 900 employees conducting economic research and advising policymakers. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia has tapped a senior economist from its sister bank in Chicago to succeed the retiring Patrick Harker as its president and CEO. Anna Paulson will represent the 3rd Federal Reserve District on the Federal Open Markets Committee in the formulation of U.S. monetary policy and lead the organization. The 3rd District includes Eastern and Central Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Southern New Jersey. She will also oversee some 900 Philadelphia Fed employees who conduct research on the local economy and advise Federal Reserve policymakers. Paulson is Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. She will take office in Philadelphia on July 1st, one day after Harker's planned retirement date. And there is a picture there of Anna Paulson. In a statement, Paulson said she looks forward to meeting people throughout the 3rd District and leading the Philadelphia Fed team who are deeply committed to fostering the stability, integrity, and efficiency of the nation's monetary, financial, and payment system. Paulson, who is 60 years old, has worked at the Chicago Fed since 2001 when she started as a senior economist. She was named Associate Director of Research in 2017 and became Director of Research in 2019. She has particular expertise in insurance industry. So that's interesting. They basically got a head of research to be the head of the Philadelphia Fed. Does that excite me? Yeah. I think maybe one of the other areas would have been a better pick, but hey, this is what they decided to do, so this is what I'm reporting on. But like I said, just it's important thing to note. So this Anna Paulson is taking over as head of the Philly Fed, and that will be on July 1st, and Patrick Harker is stepping down. So now, with that being said, let's get back to this. So now, getting back to Powell for a minute. So Trump ramps up attacks on Powell, demands loser Fed chair lower rates now. And this was from Monday. President Donald Trump ratcheted up his pressure campaign on Federal Reserve Chairman Jeremy Powell. Trump on Truth Social called Powell a major loser and warned that the U.S. economy could slow down unless interest rates fall immediately. Trump and his team are studying whether they can legally fire the central bank leader before his term is set to expire. President Donald Trump, again, like we said, he ratcheted up his comments here. Preemptive cuts in interest rates are being called for by many, Trump wrote on Truth Social. Trump claims that there is currently virtually no inflation in the U.S. and that costs for energy and most other things are on the decline. Now, I don't agree with that. I mean, to say that there's virtually no inflation, that's not true. I mean, obviously there is a lot of inflation still out there, and we still are very much battling inflation. The trick, and I think the key is, what does the trend show? Does the trend show that inflation is coming back down to the Fed's target of 2%? That's the key thing there. And you have to remember, why is Trump pushing so hard for the interest rate cuts? He's looking for two reasons. Number one, he's trying to stimulate the mortgage market. He's trying to get the housing market going again. He's trying to get things going. We're going to look at an article here in a minute. It's not looking good right now. Like a record number of people applying for mortgages are getting declined. The number of houses on the market is a little bit better, but not much. Inventory is still very low. But the cost of everything is gone. The cost of housing has gone through the roof. And it's very difficult for a lot of younger people to buy houses and get into housing right now. So, so he wants to cut the rates to help the mortgage market, but perhaps even more importantly, what we've talked about before for weeks, right, is that, Scott Bessent over at the Treasury, he's trying to roll over $9 trillion of our national debt. If we go back to our debt clock here for a minute, of this $36 trillion, we have about $9 trillion of this money that needs to be rolled over this year from shorter to longer term bonds. He is trying to get back to that. He's trying to basically say, hey, listen, we need lower rates to help us roll over and refinance this debt. And that's the biggest reason why he's pushing for the lower rates, because if we can roll the debt over at lower rates, that's going to help the debt. That's going to help the government immensely. And remember, I'll even go back to this chart for a minute here. Like, what are we spending? This chart here on the far right that we looked at a little earlier, what are we spending? $1 trillion in interest just to service the national debt. Now, obviously, if you bring interest rates down, if you lower the interest rates, it's going to make it a lot easier to make these payments on this interest to service the national debt. So there's a number of reasons why he wants that, but like I said, the Fed is basically saying that, they're just not playing along. They're not going along with this. Jeremy, this guy, unfortunately, who has the SADS right now, who's, he's still missing Grandma Janet. He misses his bestie. He misses Grandma Janet Yellen. He misses his mentor, helicopter Ben Bernanke. He misses these guys. He needs them back. And then we got this article here. So Trump's criticism of Powell is shaking markets' faith in the Fed's independence. Oh, geez. Markets reacted negatively after President Donald Trump on Monday once again criticized the Federal Reserve. Analysts said investors are uncomfortable with the notion that the president could be working to pressure the central bank. Oh, heaven forbid. Trump has removed heads of other independent agencies, and traders may be concerned that Fed Jeremy Powell could be next. Okay. So, and then I will say this. So I believe Trump did a press conference. I think it was on Tuesday. And Trump said flat out, he's not firing Jeremy Powell. He's not going to fire Jeremy Powell. And the markets basically reacted very positively to that. That bounced back. So I don't think, first of all, I don't think Trump can fire Jeremy Powell. I think Jeremy Powell is correct when he says that Trump cannot fire him right now. Right now. And what I mean by that is, Powell is safe. Will the next person be safe? We're going to get to that in just a second here. Will the next person be safe? Because, will Congress be willing to make some changes to the Federal Reserve Act and give the president the power to fire the head of the Federal Reserve? I think the president should have the power to fire the president of the Federal Reserve. I don't think, and I always say, and I will continue to say this idea that the Federal Reserve is this completely apolitical, completely independent organization. It's a joke. It's a total joke. It's always been a joke. Any serious person who has studied the Fed and understands a little bit, even a rudimentary level of politics, understands that the Fed is not an independent agency. Okay, they're not independent. They're a Fed. The Fed is highly political. Jeremy Powell is being highly political right now. And everything that Jeremy Powell has done over the last year and a half has been highly political. He cut interest rates for Biden and Harris toward the end of last year, but then once Trump got elected, it was like, oh, wait a minute, we can't do anything. We got to stop. We can't do nothing right now. Sorry, the Fed's closed. Can't help you out at the moment. So again, this is just this idea that somehow they're this impartial, like I said, apolitical, that they're just looking at the numbers and making this. It's stop. It's a bad joke. Stop. No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they don't. And no, they never have been. It's a fallacy. It's a fallacy created by our news media, particularly our business news media that propagates this stuff. But I digress, and let's continue on here. So again, the market doesn't like it when basically, oh, Jeremy Powell could be removed or whatever. So no, but what you begin to see the strategy of what Trump is going to do, though. Trump is going to ride Jeremy Powell like a show pony. That's what he's going to do. He's going to get on. I think he's going to get on social media. He might get on there every week and basically say, Jeremy Powell's an idiot. He's a loser. He needs to cut rates. He won't do anything to help us out. He's just gonna blast him every week, and then he'll threaten to fire him or threaten to do something to remove him or just threaten to mess with him a little bit, and then he'll immediately backtrack and say, well, I'm not gonna fire him. I'm not gonna do anything. And then next week he'll come out and be like, oh, he's a loser. So that's what's gonna happen there. He's just gonna make. If Powell doesn't want to do anything, like I said, he wants to take his ball and go home, then I think Trump is basically just going to make it his mission to make Powell's life miserable. And again, depending on what happens, Powell's position may become unattainable, or I should say not unattainable, untenable. His position may become untenable. If the trend shows that inflation is coming down and the economy isn't doing so hot, then it's sooner or later people are going to start to put a lot of pressure. The pendulum is going to swing the other way. People are going to start to put a lot of pressure on Powell to actually do something. Okay. Trump says Powell's a loser. The real loser might be Trump's pick for the next Fed chair. What did I just say a minute ago? President's attack on Powell could put shadow of suspicion over next central bank chief. So Trump this week called Jeremy Powell a major loser for not cutting rates, underscoring risks for the next Fed chair's credibility. Economists fear investors will question if Powell's replacement will consult Trump on interest rates. Trump's pressure on the Federal Reserve Fed could backfire by undermining investor confidence in the next Fed chair. Well, first of all, can I ask the simple question, why wouldn't the Fed chair confer with forget Powell and forget Trump for a moment. Let's just talk the office of the presidency, the office of chairman of the Federal Reserve. Why in the world would the chairman of the Federal Reserve not be talking about not be talking to the president about monetary policy and about interest rates and what they're doing and what we should be doing? I mean, aren't we all on the same team here? Aren't we all trying to achieve the same thing, which is trying to keep the U.S. economy running in peak performance, and working for everybody here? Creating jobs and creating wealth and creating prosperity. Isn't that the goal? Like, shit, aren't we supposed to be? And again, the Fed claims to be this totally independent, apolitical, but yet, they have zero interest in working with Trump and his administration. So why, I don't understand this. I mean, this just seems crazy to me. How do you justify the chairman of the Federal Reserve not working with the president to try to figure out how to fix or help the economy? Like that's insane. That's insane. And and this idea that you're going to undermine the credibility of the next chairman because that next chairman might, wait for it, want to work with Trump to try to get on the same page. Wow. It's just like I said, it's just wild. It's crazy. So all right, well, let's get Trump's top economic advisor sees de-escalation of unsustainable China trade war. So Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, said the U.S.-China trade or tariff war is unsustainable and will likely de-escalate. I would absolutely 100% agree with that comment or that assessment. Bessent's comments fueled a stock market rally due to the prospect of a deal ending a trade war that could be destructive to both economies. Bessent said the two countries have not yet begun to negotiate, but a deal is possible. Bessent made the comments at a closed-door meeting of investors hosted by J.P. Morgan Chase in Washington Tuesday. According to a report by Bloomberg, he said the two sides had not yet begun to negotiate, but that a deal was possible. In recent months, the U.S. and China have ramped up a tit-for-tat exchange of tariffs, putting higher and higher taxes on one another's exports as part of President Donald Trump's far-reaching trade war against U.S. trade partners. U.S. tariffs against China are as high as 245% on certain products, according to the White House. So let's keep going with the story here for a minute. There's more to this. Treasury Secretary Bessent says China and U.S. have opportunity for a big deal on trade. So this just kind of, if they want to rebalance, let's do it together, Bessent said during an appearance at the Institute of International Finance in Washington, D.C. But Bessent also called out the World Bank for lending to nations that have advanced economic growth, including China. So I loved this. Scott Bessent went in to the Institute of International Finance in Washington, and he gave it to the IMF and the World Bank. He gave it to them both right between the eyes. Boom. And now they downplayed that in this article, but that's exactly what he did. And he basically said that, hey, look, if China, and what he's signaling to China here is that, look, guys, the days of getting one over on us and stealing all our intellectual property and just taking advantage of us left and right, those days are done. They're done and they're over. And we are going to bring manufacturing back here to the United States, and if you want to rebalance, we can do that together. We can work together and we can make a big deal that works for everybody. But do I see a deal happening at some point? Yes. But I mean, if you're China, are you going to make a deal right now at this moment? No, you're not. China in a lot of respects is in the catbird seat. I mean, they have the manufacturing now. They have the manufacturing base. They have the manufacturing wherewithal. They control a lot of the supply chain, perhaps even the most critical parts of the supply chain. And so therefore, they have us in a very bad situation. Does that mean that we are helpless? Does that mean that we cannot inflict a lot of pain on China? Oh, yes, we can. Oh, yes, we can. We can inflict a lot of pain on them. But we are also in this situation where both economies and both countries need each other because we are both completely tied to each other. We outsourced our manufacturing to them. So they export all this stuff back to us. So they need us to buy this stuff. Okay. They need us. If we're not buying this stuff from them, they're in big trouble. In return, we need them to buy our national debt. When we put out these bonds, okay, we need them buying our national debt, which they have been major buyers of. And if they're not buying our national debt, and in turn, if they're actually dumping treasuries, that's a really bad thing for us. So basically think of it as like two heavyweight boxers in the ring. We could beat each other up. We could bloody each other up real bad and real nice, real quick. And is there an opportunity for a deal? There is, but I think we're gonna have to bring the pain to China in a major way, and unfortunately, in order to force them to the table to make a deal, because right now they're loving it. They're going, okay, anybody wants to deal with us? They're stealing all our intellectual property. They're buying our farmland. They've invaded our universities. They're messing with our military. They're threatening to take over Taiwan, which would give them, if they did do that, that would give them control of all of the major microchips, the most advanced microchips in the world. And they understand this. They know this perfectly well. So there is, I'm eventually going to talk about, there's this whole concept of unrestricted warfare with China. And not a topic that I would normally cover on the channel, but I think it might be an appropriate time given these tariff wars, I'd say tariff war basically with the US and China. I think this might be a good time to start talking about some of those things, to basically start talking about, what China's doing, how China has taken advantage of the US, and why it's time to stop this. It's long past. This is a fight that's long overdue. We built China, our money, our financing. We built China. China would be nothing today without the United States. We built them. We gave them what we financed it. The development of their country, we financed all of it. We gave them all of our manufacturing jobs. Basically, we've built them into the powerhouse that they are. But again, so what we giveth, we could take away. And so, like I said, it's an interesting thing. So I think at some point I am going to get into this whole idea of unrestricted warfare. And I've got a couple books on this. I can definitely talk about this. And I think that by bringing those different things into perspective, people will understand this standoff, if you will, with China, this tariff war with China. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but let's continue on here for just a second. So Trump asserts trade talks with China are underway after Beijing denies any ongoing negotiations. So this was the next shoe that dropped. So U.S. President Donald Trump on Thursday refuted China's claims that there were no ongoing trade discussions between Beijing and Washington. At present, there are absolutely no negotiations on the economy and trade between China and the U.S. China's Ministry of Commerce spokesman He Yadong said earlier on Thursday. Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent this week indicated that there might be an easing in tensions with China. So, look, here's my take on that. Do I think that there are discussions going on? Yes, absolutely. Does China want to admit to those discussions at the time? No, because they're concerned about losing face. Xi Jinping does not want to lose face right now. He's got enough problems back at home to deal with. He can't lose face by basically letting Trump, punk him, so to speak, on these tariffs. He can't lose that. His government will not allow him to lose face like that. He will lose power. He will literally be removed from office if Trump basically takes him to the cleaners on this tariff fight. That's how serious this is for him. So of course his guy is going to come right out and say, "Oh no, there's no talks, there's no discussions, nothing's going on. We're committed to going full bore with this whole thing. Nothing's going on here." So like I said, I think there's a little truth on both sides to this. I do think that there are a little bit of talks going on in the background. Have they become, again, are they really pushing hard right now to do something? No. Do I think there's a little bit of talk, a little bit going on back and forth? Yeah, I do, but like I said, well, we have to wait to see what happens. And then here's just a couple other interesting articles on the tariff thing, and then we'll get off that because I need to review episodes here in a minute. So Trump tariffs lead to surge of companies parking imports in tax-free foreign trade zones. So foreign trade zones and bonded warehouses are specially designated secured storage or manufacturing sites approved by U.S. Customs that allow for the temporary avoidance of tariffs. More companies started looking to FTZs between the presidential election and start of Trump's new trade war, and membership has surged to an all-time high. So large companies, large and small, are turning to special U.S. Customs-approved sites to avoid, at least temporarily, the payment of new tariffs implemented by President Trump. These locations, called foreign trade zones, FTZs, and bonded warehouses, are specially designated secured storage or manufacturing sites approved by U.S. Customs where freight is not subject to U.S. duties or excise taxes. Duties are only paid by the importer when the goods are transferred out of the FTZ or bonded warehouse for U.S. market consumption. So this is, like I said, this is just kind of an interesting thing. This whole idea of these FTZs and companies parking their wares, if you will, in there. Now, this is, again, it's only a temporary thing, but I think they're just waiting to see how things play out. And obviously, they're trying to put off paying some of these new tariffs as long as they can. But that's only going to last but for so long. But I just thought it was something. I just thought it was very interesting. I thought it was something very interesting to note. Okay, here. Trump wants automakers to move vehicle production to the U.S. It's not that simple. So President Donald Trump wants automakers to produce in the U.S., but moving massive assembly plants isn't that easy. Relocating production lines takes years of planning and construction and can be costly. The actual construction of assembly plant has to be done in conjunction with hiring workers, building infrastructure such as water and energy supplies, and building out parts supply chain, among other considerations. So here's why I find this article so interesting. Okay, again, we're getting back to the theme of the night: history. What do we know about the history of the automakers? Well, they've done some pretty fascinating things over the years, and they've done it very quickly. World War II, when the government came in and basically took over Ford and GM and said, hey, you guys are going to start building tanks and planes and all kinds of other stuff for us. Okay. And they made that change right quick. During President Biden's administration, he comes out and basically says he put in this EV mandate and said, we're going to all electric cars, stop production of making gas powered engines. By 2030, we're going to be all electric, and you got to move full bore. Man, GM and Ford, man, baby, they were just, they couldn't run down that EV road fast enough. They were just, as soon as, hey, Biden said it, so they just snap right to it, man, no problem. But Trump says, hey, guys, I want you to bring production back to the U.S. And, oh, by the way, all of the auto unions, all of the auto workers, they are loving this. They are loving Trump for this right now because they see more jobs. They see more union members, which means more union dues, which means more union money. They see the perks of this, and why the guys at the top are pushing, it's crazy. Like, if I was GM and Ford right now, I would be running back to the Trump administration and I would be saying, hey guys, could we get some tax cuts? Maybe some tax breaks, maybe some incentives. Could you guys sweeten the pot a little bit to make something happen here? You would think that a smart business person, that's what they would be doing. They'd be looking for the opportunity, not the politics, but the opportunity, and basically saying, hey, could we delve in here and make something happen? But apparently they're not, so interested. Apparently they want to just drag their feet and, it's going to take forever. It's just too long. We can't do this, I don't think it's really that big a deal. I think they could turn. I mean, look at all of the empty manufacturing buildings that we have in the U.S. right now. I mean, it's crazy. There are tens of thousands of empty manufacturing buildings in the U.S. There are buildings that could very easily be repurposed. I'm looking at Michigan, man. I'm looking at Detroit. Okay, I'm looking at the wasteland that has become Detroit. Sorry for anybody that lives in Detroit out there. But you're not telling me that there's a lot of properties in there that could be repurposed very quickly, say within the next 2 years, and they could get stuff basically up and running and rolling very quickly. I think they absolutely could. But again, for whatever reason, they want to just drag their feet. Okay, let me see here. What do I want to get to? All right, we're going to come back to this in a minute. This basically says credit a short squeeze for the stock market's big 2-day bounce. So we found out this week that one of the big reasons why the stock market was going down was because there was this massive shorting of the stock market. You know, a lot of some people probably believing that, oh, okay, that the tariffs were going to crater the economy, at least crater the stock market. So you had a lot of people betting. Unfortunately, that bet started to work against them. It started to go the wrong way, and they ran into what's called a short squeeze. So they're getting squeezed. So basically, they had to get out of those trades, and that was part of the thing that was pushing the market back up. So unfortunately, a lot of, I think, hedge funds and private equities and even some of the big banks that were basically playing politics. Okay, I think intentionally. I'm going to use that word. I think intentionally trying to short the market. They got smacked back. They got smacked back real hard this week. But like I said, we'll come back to that in a minute. So, okay. What I want to do is go into all of the usual stuff I usually go into at this point. I want to review because it's been a couple weeks now, so I need to get back here and just go over. I'm going to run through basically a lot of the episodes that I put up here over the last 3 weeks. I'm not going to dive into descriptions of deep details of every single episode because some of these things we're just covering like economic reports, so they don't need a whole lot of description and detail. But I also wanted to point out some of the episodes that were a lot more popular than others. So let's go back to April 7th, and we're going to talk about episode 357, which was an update on Social Security changes. So anybody out there, either if I got any retirees watching, anybody on Social Security, either watching or listening to the podcast, definitely want to go check that out. I think there were some very interesting updates in there for people to look at. On April 8th, I had episode 358 came out, and that was basically farmer debt continues to grow at ag-focused banks in 2024. And that was a report on basically agricultural lending at some of the main ag banks that came out and basically said, hey, debt for farmers continues to grow. Little bit of spike up in delinquency, nothing too bad, but definitely something to keep an eye on. So I thought that was an interesting report. Then on April 9th, we had episode 359, which was Treasury review of First National Bank of Lindsay failure. So First National Bank of Lindsay was a very small bank that failed, but it failed because of some fraud that was perpetrated by one of their employees. And it was very interesting. I don't think we definitely don't have the full story. This was just a very brief, almost like a memo put out by the Treasury Department, basically just detailing like, hey, we had this bank. It was a smaller bank. It failed. And it failed because this employee there had perpetrated this fraud. And so they have a full review of this whole case that's going to be coming out probably later in the year. I would suspect maybe like October, November timeframe. So I'll report back to everybody on then. But, anytime there's like a bank failure, regardless of how big or small, I always like to report on it just because it's a part of what happens in the banking business. And I find some of the bank failures can be very fascinating because a lot of times there's a lot of bad dealings there. There could be fraud, CEOs doing stupid things, so you can learn a lot of valuable lessons from bank failures. You can, again, it's, we note a lot of things in the banking industry over time, but we don't always learn from the mistakes that happen. We have this tendency in the banking business to continue to make kind of the same mistakes over and over again, which is sad, but it's kind of a hard truth of the business. Then on April 10th and April 11th, I covered the Small Business Credit Survey, which gets put out from the Fed every year. And what they do is they when they put out the Small Business Credit Survey is a massive survey that gets put out by the Fed. They look at a lot of different aspects of small businesses, everything from their hiring, their borrowing, how they use money, what are revenues looking like? Like, are they planning on hiring more people in the next year? Startup companies, all that kind of a lot of different data. So what they usually do is they take that small business credit report, the credit survey, and they usually break it down, and they'll create basically 5 or 6 smaller reports from that one giant survey. And so what they did here was they put out the first part of that survey, which was the report on employer firms. And there was so much information there that I couldn't cover it in one episode. So I decided to break it up into 2 episodes. And that's what I did so on April 10th, there was episode 360, which was the SBCS, the Small Business Credit Survey 2025 report on employer firms, which is part 1. And then on April 11th was episode 361, which was part 2. So now fast forward to the next week. On April 14th, I released episode 362, which was a review of Bank Director's 2025 risk survey. Now, this is a survey that Bank Director does every year. It's just a survey looking at risk. What do banks see as the top risks right now in the industry? Obviously, fraud, major problems, cybersecurity risk, still, one of the top 2 things there. And but again, a great survey, fantastic data, fantastic information there. I highly recommend everybody go check that out when they get a chance. And then the next 2 episodes were basically just looking at some other interesting reports. So on April 15th, we had episode 363, which was review of the OCC's mortgage performance report for the 4th quarter of 2024. Now, that is a quarterly report that comes out from the OCC. It basically just looks at first mortgages, just strictly looking at residential mortgages, first mortgage liens, and they, basically tells us what's the performance going on right now. And basically, their performance said things were pretty good. But again, a lot of interesting data in that report, some interesting graphs and other things in there. So, definitely worth checking out. And then on April 16th, I did episode 364, which was a review of the OCC Bank Trading Revenue Report for the 4th quarter of 2024. And again, another quarterly report that the Fed points out. But this report is known by a different name. It's also known as the derivatives report. So if you want to get information on derivatives, and this is really why I like looking at this report, not so much for the trading revenue, but to see what are banks, what is the derivatives market look like. And the derivatives numbers, I always tell everybody, are eye-popping. They are absolutely eye-popping. Like when you see these derivatives numbers, it's like $270 trillion in the derivatives markets. Like you can't even fathom these numbers. So again, that's a huge reason why I like to look at that report, and I like to study it and really take an in-depth look at what's going on there. So. And then on April 17th, I did episode 365, which was Let's Talk About ESG and DEI. Now, this was definitely one of the more popular episodes. I was not surprised. I was very apprehensive in covering this topic just because of politics and where things are right now. Not really trying to necessarily jump into the political divide, as it were. I really, again, I talk a little bit of politics, but I like to think I kind of stay on the fringes of this. I mean, again, this show is really all about economics and banking and finance, and maybe a little bit about how technology influences that world. But it's definitely not a political show. It's not. I mean, again, most of the politics that I talk about are a lot about what's going on at the Fed, and then also talking about regulation and how that regulation, will impact the banking industry. And that's really where politics comes into the program. But outside of that, I try to stay out of a lot of this stuff, especially some more of the cultural issues like ESG and DEI. But I just felt like, with all of the information out there right now, with all the things going on, I felt like I wouldn't I know I had to cover it in some aspects. So that's what I tried to do with this episode, was to try to cover it real quick. And I know some people probably like it, some people may not, and that's fine. But like I said, I just wanted to put it out there and just cover it real quick and just say, so if anybody asks, I could say, hey, I covered it. It's out there. Go check it out. But like I said, that has been one of the more popular episodes. So if you want to go look at it, see what you think. Then I did episode 366, which was called Let's Build a High Performance Sales Culture. And I thought this episode I actually thought was really fun. This was also one of the more, more popular episodes the last few weeks here. A lot of people seem to like this, just talking about how do you really hype up that sales culture? What are some of the things that you can do inside your organization to focus on building the sales team, building a really highly competitive, highly focused, high performing sales culture within your bank? And again, great article. We covered an article from Bank Director in that episode. So again, if sales is your thing, or if you're really looking at more focusing on sales, definitely, check out that episode. Now we get to this week. And I did episode 367, which was called What Happened When OpenAI Fired Sam Altman. And again, I thought this was a really interesting episode. This episode didn't quite catch on right earlier in the week, but it's kind of, people are finally starting to look at it now here toward the end of the week. And I think people really should go and check it out, because I covered an article from the Wall Street Journal, which basically talked all about, like, hey, how Sam Altman got fired, why he got fired, what were the inner workings, the inner politics there. And I think it's a fascinating case to look at just in terms of board dynamics. But again, I'm not crazy about Sam Altman. I don't think he's a particularly good fellow. And like I said, but go check that out. I think it's a really good story. I think people will really like it. And so definitely check that out when you have a second. And then I did episode 368, which was how can banks utilize marketing personalization? And this is basically really about like a digital marketing campaign. How can banks be more effective running a digital marketing campaign? Again, I thought this was a great episode. We covered an article from Independent Banker magazine. So I hope people go and check that out. The next couple episodes were basically about different types of AI fraud. So I covered, on Wednesday, I had episode 369, which was how can banks fight AI-powered elder fraud? In other words, a lot of people are using AI, particularly like deep fakes, different, copying people's voices and things like that, and using that to perpetrate fraud on the elderly. And how can banks fight against that? How can banks find a way to deal with that issue? And then on Thursday, I did episode 370, which was how can banks fight AI-boosted spear phishing fraud? Spear phishing, just another type of fraud, but now you kind of add AI into the mix, and it adds a whole nother wrinkle to this whole thing. And then you get into this, spear phishing is really more email focused and email driven. And and now you've got AI in the mix. So the AI is basically just creating these emails, sending them out to thousands, if not millions of people. And basically how do banks, deal with that? Then you also have this concept of business email compromise, BEC, where a fraudster will basically hack into your business email, get control of the business email, and then will just sit there could be for a long time, and they will just watch your email. They'll watch all your emails come through, and they'll see, who do you deal with? What are their names? What kind of things do you ask them for? What kind of things do you ask them to do? And what they're trying to do is they're really trying to get somebody in the finance and accounting department, because they want somebody who deals with the money. So that's what they're really going after there. So again, another interesting episode. And then finally, yesterday, I put out episode 371, which was how do you build a net worth over $500,000? I thought this was a really interesting article I think that was from Investopedia. And it was really interesting. It was just kind of talking about, well, how can anybody, the premise of the article was basically anybody using a little bit of diligence and a little bit of patience can basically build up and create a net worth of $500,000. And I basically agree with that. I think that yes, like I think pretty much anybody, if you have the right habits, anybody can build to that goal over a period of time. If you have 20, 30, 40 years, you work on that a little bit. And yes, I think that is absolutely I don't want to say it's not that hard to do, but it is definitely it's doable. It is absolutely doable. And so again, I thought this was an interesting episode. Again, I always have to preface it that, hey, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not an attorney. I'm not an accountant. Go out, seek out those financial professionals. I'm not on here to basically give financial advice in any way, shape, or form. If again, I'm not like reporting on individual companies per se, or saying, oh, hey, you should do this or do that or whatever. So that's not really my game. So I would tell you again, go check with those finance professionals. But I do like to talk a lot about strategy. I do like to talk about the psychology of money and how can consumers build wealth over time and different aspects of that. Like I did an episode at the very beginning of the podcast on a personal financial statement. Just what is a personal financial statement? Why should you use a personal financial statement? How can a personal financial statement help you to manage your finances and build your wealth over time? So things like that, I definitely get into, which again, and I'm just hoping in the vein of being educational, that will help a lot of listeners over time. So anyway, okay. So those were the episodes that I put out over the last 3 weeks. Just catching all this up, guys. So what happens when you go on vacation for 1 week and it's just crazy back up. But like I said, changes to Social Security, Bank Directors 2025 risk survey. Building a high-performance sales culture, ESG and DEI, building a net worth over 500,000, and an OpenAI firing Sam Altman. So those were the more popular episodes over the last 3 weeks. And if you get a chance, definitely go check them out. So, okay. Now, with that being said, I want to get into just a couple other things here. So let's talk about let's get into economic reports here for a second. What economic indicators do we have coming out this week? So on Tuesday, so nothing's coming out on Monday. On Tuesday, April 29th, we have goods trade balance. We have the CB consumer confidence. We get the JOLTS job openings for March. The Atlanta Fed GDP now for the first quarter at 10:30 on Tuesday. That'll be huge. Everybody will be looking for that. API weekly crude oil stock. On Wednesday, April 30th, we get the ADP non-farm employment change. We get the official GDP number for the first quarter. Again, everyone will be looking at that one. That'll be big. Chicago PMI. And now we get back to the inflation numbers again. So we get the core PCE price index, pending home sales, personal spending. On Thursday, May 1st, we get continuing jobless claims. We get initial jobless claims. We get the manufacturing PMI and the ISM manufacturing PMI. On Friday, May 2nd, we get the average hourly earnings, non-farm payrolls, participation rate, unemployment rate, factory orders, and we get the U.S. Baker Hughes oil rig count. Now, so we're going to get GDP and some inflation data, and we're going to get a whole lot of the labor force data, job market data this week. We're going to get a lot of big. Last week was very light on economic indicators and economic information, other than the mortgage stuff, which we'll get back into and talk about in just a minute here. But this week, obviously, big stuff coming out. Wednesday is going to be the big day. Obviously, GDP and the core PCE price index. If the inflation continues to show an easing, again, that's going to put pressure on Jeremy Powell to try to. Hey, Powell, you need to come back to the table, man. You need to talk to us. You need to start to do something here if the trend continues to go in the right direction, which I think it will. The GDP numbers, this could be big. Okay. And people need to realize this week, don't panic on Wednesday. Don't panic on Wednesday. You may not want to even look at the stock market on Wednesday. If the GDP numbers are negative, if GDP for the first quarter is negative, I think that you're going to see the stock market down probably quite a bit. You might even see it down 1,000 points, 2,000 points in on Wednesday. Even if the inflation numbers are good, that's just where we're at. And I think just be ready for it. Be cognizant of it. So if that first quarter GDP number is negative, then it's going to be a bad day. So just be aware of that. But like I said, but like with everything else, it'll be a bad day, but then things will bounce back. I keep telling everybody we're on a little bit of a roller coaster right now. The stock market it's going to go up and it's going to go down, and that's the way it's going to be for a little while. And we're gonna have weeks like this last week. Things are up, not too bad, and then we're gonna have weeks like what might come this week where it might be a bad week. But again, doesn't mean the economy is imploding, doesn't mean the stock market's imploding. It just we're in a period of volatility right now. That's all there is to it. So okay, gosh, I got so much stuff to get to. We don't have enough time. All right, give me 1 second here, guys. All right. All right, here's what I want to do. I want to get back to some of these articles here because I do have a bunch of things that I want to get covered with you guys. I wanted to give you guys some other banking news, but I might have to just save that for next week. So, all right, so let's get back here for a second. So again, this kind of short squeeze, if you will, for the stock market for this big 2-day bounce. So a key force at the center of the stock market's massive 2-day rally is the frantic behavior of short sellers covering their losses. So short covering was on display Tuesday and Wednesday as stocks shot up on signs of easing tensions on trade, even though no concrete deals have been reached yet. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said Wednesday there is an opportunity for a big deal here on trade issues between the U.S. and China. So I think, and again, this is just my opinion, I think that there were a lot of Wall Street players that were betting more on politics. I'll say that. They're betting more on politics than fundamentals. In other words, we're gonna stick it to the Trump administration here, so to speak, we're going to drive this market. We're going to drive the stock market down. And they were doing that for a few weeks. And I think it was working very effectively, but there's not really, again, I think that this whole tariffs argument here, the quote unquote tariff war in certain respects is very overblown. You've got the media having just a freak out over this. I'm gonna say my opinion here on how I think this is going to play out, and everybody, and we'll see. Like I said, this is going to take. It's going to take the rest of this year. It's going to take 7-8 months for this whole thing, I think, to play out, and it's going to go in. I imagine it's going to go into early next year. Is it going to take that long to work out deals with the majority of countries? No. I think they're already talking right now with 70, 80, 90 countries around the world. I think we are going to work out deals with a lot of those countries, and I think we're going to work out extremely favorable deals. I think it's either going to be, hey, you got tariffs of 25%, the U.S. will have tariffs of 20%. So we'll both have tariffs of 25%. Some countries are going to be okay with that. Other countries, the U.S. is going to be, hey, man, you're going to charge us 25 and we're going to charge you 40. And that's how it's going to be. And that's it. And that country might be okay with that. And they might say, all right, hey, that's fine. Just leave it at 40. Don't make it over 40 and we'll live with it. I think you're going to see some of that. I think you're going to see other countries that are going to come back and say, hey, listen, if we're going to charge you 25 and you're going to charge us 25, why don't we just both say 0 and just leave it at that? And I think in the U.S. we'll probably be like, okay, yeah, that's fine. And then, we take their 25% tariff down to 0. So, so I think there's going to be a lot of those kind of deals that are going to get worked out. And I think they're going to get worked out very quickly here over the next 6 months. The big one is going to be China, and the China one is going to be, that's going to take some time. I think that could take a year to basically work that out and resolve it. Because I think like I said, you're going to have a lot of back and forth. Again, China can't afford to lose face. They can't afford to lose face in this whole thing. So they need to look strong, and they need to look strong at least for a while. But when the pain begins to set in on both sides, sooner or later, that's going to force both sides to come back to the table. And I think that's what will happen. So I think that that'll be a little slower to play out. But in the meantime, we are going to get a lot of deals. And I mean a lot. We're going to get 60, 70, 80, 90 deals with 100 plus countries around the world. And I think we're going to get all those deals knocked out, like I said, in the next 6 months. And I would say that 95% of those deals are going to be very favorable to the U.S. and they're going to dramatically help us reduce our trade imbalance, our trade deficit, which was literally almost $1 trillion just about last year. So I think that's going to help us immensely. So, but that, again, that's just my opinion. That's just how I think this is going to play out, but we'll see. Anyway, okay, moving on. Okay, here's what I talked about a little bit earlier. So March home sales drop to their lowest pace since 2009. So sales of previously owned homes in March fell 5.9% from February. Inventory, however, was up nearly 20% from a year earlier. So like I said, we have seen an increase of inventory. More inventory and slower sales are starting to put a chill on prices. Yes, so we're slowly moving back to a buyer's market, but a lot of that really depends on where you live. I mean, we're still seeing pockets where there's some bidding wars. People are still paying over asking price, waiving appraisals and inspections and all this other stuff. So there's still certain pockets where some funky things are going on, but for the most part, we're seeing this increase in inventory. But the bigger issue is affordability, and prices are still super high. Interest rates are still, 7%, over 7% for a 30-year mortgage. So we're still struggling with a lot of this stuff. And so, this is, again, what I talked about earlier, this is why, President Trump wants the interest rates to come down to try to help to reignite this mortgage market. Now, I will say this. Some people won't like this. I'm going to say it anyway. If you want to fix the housing market, get rid of some of these illegals that came in. Sorry. You want to bring the price of houses down. You want to you don't like the fact if you're renting right now and you don't like the fact that you're paying $2,000 a month for a studio apartment in some place. Get some of all the illegal immigrants that came in here in the last 3 years. Yeah. Ship them back. You ship 10 million people, 15 million people out of here, and all of a sudden, all these problems in housing dramatically, prices will start to come back down to reality a little bit. That'll hurt some people because they'll lose, again, some of that equity in their house. But in the long run, it's going to be incredibly beneficial because people will be able to afford houses again. There will be inventory on the market again. People, that affordability issue won't be there. Younger people will be able to start buying houses again. So, again, a big part of this problem in housing has to do with population issues and the number of people that have come into this country in the last 4 years. That's what's driving a big part of this. And it's amazing to me. And again, I understand the politics of it. I understand why people don't want to talk about it or they don't want to say the hard truth, but that's the reality. You want to solve this housing problem. You want to bring prices back down. Yeah, you're going to have to ship some people out of here. That's the hard, cold truth. Okay. Why the dollar hit a 3-year low on Monday. So let's look at this. So the U.S. dollar index slid to a 3-year low on Monday as President Donald Trump's threat to end the U.S. central bank's independence put financial markets on edge. Trump has criticized Federal Reserve Chair Jeremy Powell's handling of monetary policy and has recently threatened to fire him. Stocks, the dollar, and treasuries have all slumped this month, suggesting to some market watchers that Trump's policies have eroded faith in the U.S. assets that underpin global finance. So the dollar is decreasing for a number of reasons. Obviously, there are concerns over the tariffs, but you also have massive concerns over the interest rates in the United States in terms of the national debt and rolling over said national debt. The federal deficit, people are concerned about the credit quality of the United States. So there's a lot of issue there with a number of different factors and a number of things going on, and that's what's really causing the dollar to slump. It doesn't really have anything to do with Trump and Powell and them going back and forth. That really has not much bearing on what's happening with the dollar. The dollar is weakening for a myriad of other reasons, but I did want to point it out. Gold surges to a record above 3,400 as Trump threatens Fed. And again, Monday, everything was Trump threatening to fire Jeremy Powell. But gold has been on a tear this year as Trump's tariffs shake investor confidence as central banks buy up the precious metal. So it's kind of funny how, again, it's Trump, the tariff war, but yet it's the central banks running out buying all the gold, right? By the way, in case people didn't know, central banks have been a net buyer of gold for like the last 6 years. So this is not new. And for anybody who understands the economics and the economy on a slightly deeper level, so gold is a hedge and people are buying it because they're worried about a lot of things right now. But gold is also, you could also think of gold as a report card on the performance of the Fed. How is the Fed doing? Well, if gold is at an all-time record high, that would generally indicate that the Fed's not doing such a hot job. And that's the big thing that goes on with one of the big things that goes on with the price of gold. So when you look at the price of gold, I want you to think about that. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, that if all these people are running out buying gold, including the central banks, well, there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the central bank is not doing such a hot job. But central bankers do not like you will very rarely, if ever hear Powell talk about the price of gold. And the reason why is because it's basically a judge of his job performance. But a lot of people, they don't look at it like that. They don't look at it. They don't think about that when they're looking at it, because they're just like, oh, well, it's gold and gold's going up and it's a hedge against inflation and blah, blah, blah. And, so no, it is a deeper psychology to gold spiking through the roof. But again, I have to keep an eye on this because it's really interesting. I have a lot of articles and a lot of information from the world. What is it? If I'm looking at this here, so the World Gold Council. If you've never had a chance to go on and look at the World Gold Council, their website, tremendous amount of data and information on there. They do fantastic research, really highlight everything that's going on in the gold market. And I really should do an in-depth look at the gold market's a fascinating market because it runs all over the world. You have the London Gold Exchange, the London Metals Exchange, which is the oldest in the world. And then you have New York, the New York Fed and JP Morgan Chase. And then you also have Shanghai over in China. So the Shanghai gold market. So those are the three big gold markets in the world. But then you also have, you have the gold mining industry, which plays the miners play big into it. You also have the stock market, and how like a lot of IPOs, a lot of maybe it hasn't been so for the last year or so, but up in Canada, believe it or not, a lot of miners and a lot of people that were interested in getting into the gold markets, they actually went, if you had a company or if you were starting it or whatever, a lot of people would do IPOs up on the Canada Stock Exchange for things like that, because it was easier to get things done, easier to raise money that way than coming through the US markets. So there's a lot of again, how the gold market works and the inventory of gold, how it ships around the world, how they use it. You notice that, for about a week, we had this whole story about how Trump and all these guys were going to go over and they were going to audit Fort Knox in Kentucky. You notice how that story has completely disappeared, completely gone away. And I pose a question. Could it be that there's no gold in Fort Knox, or the gold that's there we don't own? And basically somebody said, dude, they were like, they're like, if you go over to Fort Knox and you open those doors and there's no gold there, okay, dude, the stock market, could you imagine what would happen to the stock market? The stock market would be down 40% in a day. So again, it doesn't shock me that all that news about going over to Fort Knox to see if the gold was really still there. It's not shocking to me one bit that just completely evaporated and went away, because I think the truth is pretty ugly. I think the truth is pretty ugly, and again, they don't want to they don't want to go there. They don't want to pull that out. They don't want to open that wound, because that wound is a brutal wound. But to get back to my point, the gold market is a fascinating market, and it's the inner workings of it, how it works, all the different aspects of it, different components of it. So I really should break that down at some point. I really should do an episode on that and break it down. So, okay. All right. This, I have to say, really kind of pissed me off this week. I hate to say it that way, but Citadel's Ken Griffin warns Trump about tarnishing the brand of the U.S. Treasuries. Okay. So Ken Griffin gets on and he starts going off. So for anybody who doesn't know who Ken Griffin is, Ken Griffin runs one of the biggest hedge funds, Citadel. And I hate Ken Griffin. Ken Griffin's not a good guy. Ken Griffin has made his money by scamming retail investors and many other investors in the stock market. And you say, well, whoa. How could you say that? Well, Ken Griffin, Citadel started out as a high frequency trading firm. And what they did was they would buy all of, say, from like TD Ameritrade. Okay. If you guys remember TD Ameritrade before it merged into Charles Schwab. So they had an exclusive agreement with TD Ameritrade where they would buy all of their customers' trading data, and then they would process trades on behalf of TD Ameritrade. And this is just one example. They were doing this all over the place with many different brokerages and different companies out there. So you place your trade on TD Ameritrade, and you thought that TD Ameritrade was placing that trade and it was running through TD Ameritrade. No. TD Ameritrade then gave it to Citadel, and then Citadel was then placing your trade. So Citadel saw everything that you were doing, and that gave Citadel, as a high frequency trading firm, the ability to do what's called front running. They front runned your trade. Now, this is in a certain respect, this is like making pennies off of each trade, but those pennies add up to billions of dollars every year if you process enough volume. Thus, they needed to run around and deal with Robinhood and with TD Ameritrade and with all these other places. So Ken Griffin has shafted millions of people around the U.S. and made billions of dollars in the process. So I would say, if Ken Griffin wants to keep running his mouth, which I hope he does, I actually hope he does. I hope he keeps running his mouth, because somebody's going to raise their hand and say, hey, I think we need to take a real close look at what Citadel's been doing for the last 20 years and how they've been shafting retail customers all over the United States. And we need to talk about order payment flow, and we need to talk about front running, and we need to talk about the actual, what's called the plumbing of the stock market. We need to have a really serious conversation about all that. And oh, by the way, all of you guys that use Robinhood, this is why I hate Robinhood. If you use Robinhood, okay, Robinhood is selling all your information to Citadel. That's how Robinhood makes money. Robinhood, remember, oh, that's right, you're getting free trades on Robinhood, right? You trade for free on Robinhood. No, you don't trade for free on Robinhood. You actually get shafted by Robinhood, because you place your trade, which you think is going through Robinhood, it's going through Citadel. It's going through Citadel. You're placing that trade, and it's going through Citadel, and Citadel is front running your trades. Okay. Is what it is. You have to understand how these things work. Again, some people probably, they might disagree with that. It's one of those taboo subjects that nobody wants to talk about. I remember if you ever seen the movie Dumb Money, I did a review of Dumb Money. If you watch that movie, there's a scene in there where the two co-CEOs, co-founders of Robinhood are doing an interview with a financial outlet. I don't know if it was CNBC or whoever, but they're sitting there and they're doing this interview and they start talking about, well, they're like, well, how do you guys make money? Well, we make money from order payment flow. And then like, oh, well, what's order payment flow? Oh, well, you see, we sell everybody's trading information to Citadel. And then immediately the other co-founder starts, jabbing him with his elbow in the ribs, basically, shut up, shut up, shut up. We don't want to talk about that. So, and that actually happened. That actually happened in a real interview. But they portray it in the movie. They show it in the movie. You could go watch it for yourself. But yeah, this is a big taboo topic that Wall Street and these high frequency trading firms like Citadel, these high frequency hedge funds, they do not want to talk about this because they don't want you to understand how they've been shafting you. And what was it? Was it Michael Lewis? Yeah, it was Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis wrote the book Flash Boys about eight. I think it was probably about 8 or 9 years ago now. But I definitely need to cover Flash Boys. That's another book that I really need to cover because people, if we went through Flash Boys and people understood that, it would blow your mind. It would blow your mind. And again, and Michael Lewis, he took Wall Street, they wanted a scalp, man. They wanted a scalp on Mr. Michael Lewis. But anyway, all right, I digress. It's going. All right, let's see here. What else do we got here? All right, let's run through a couple other things here, guys. Let's see here. Let's go. Businesses look. So here's an interesting thing here. I want to show you guys something here in a minute. So we're going to look at a couple articles here real quick, and I'm going to try to take a look at this very quickly. So businesses look to their wealthiest customers in an uncertain economy. So this is not unusual. So businesses are looking to their wealthiest customers to compensate for a pullback in spending among other consumers. So Delta and United Airlines have said premium ticket sales are booming along with international travel. Luxury retailers are optimistic that wealthy households' finances can withstand economic uncertainty. So in other words, if we go all the way back to this article here at the beginning of the night, where I talked about the explosion in wealth amongst the ultra wealthy, okay, and then we come back, is there any doubt that a lot of these companies are now basically changing focus and saying, hey, we need to focus on our super wealthy customers because they're the ones that still have disposable income. They're the ones that aren't going to stop spending. They're not going to change their lifestyle and their behavior just because the stock market goes down a little bit or because the economy pulls back a little bit. Okay, so again, very normal behavior. This is what always happens in business. There's nothing unusual about this, but it's a pattern that I want to point out to you here. So, okay. Then we have another article here. So consumer finances may be in better shape because they've cut back on spending. A Bank of America analysis here. So Bank of America data released Tuesday showed that fewer Americans had revolving credit card balances in March than a year earlier. A dip in median checking and savings balances has been slowing, and balances ticked up from February to March, the report said. Although many are in a better position than they were pre-pandemic, lower income households are showing some signs of strain, the research showed. So, it's an interesting thing here. So consumer finances, they may be, in better shape because they've cut back on certain kinds of spending here. But let's keep going here. Let's look at some other things here. So orders for big ticket items like autos and appliances surged 9.2% in March in a rush to beat tariffs. So some of this spending, particularly on big ticket items, is in regard to this fear over tariffs. People are like, well, I better get it now because it's going to be more expensive in a little while. So we're actually seeing this surge, so to speak, in consumer spending, which again is kind of unusual because it's basically, as we've been reporting for the last umpteen months, that like, hey, the consumer's hurting. The consumer's really tapped out. But we're going to look at a couple other articles here in just a second. So So-called durable goods orders soared a seasonally adjusted 9.2% on the month, up from 0.9% gain in February and well ahead of the Dow Jones forecast for a 1.6% increase. In other economic news Thursday, the Labor Department reported an initial claims for unemployment insurance loss to a seasonally adjusted 222,000. So, but these durable good orders, big ticket items, really shot up in March. So we saw this huge surge. So people are obviously spending. Here's another interesting article. 42% of Americans under 30 say they're barely getting by financially. A Harvard survey finds. So 42% of Americans under 30, they're barely getting by. So young Americans are sounding the alarm about their finances, with roughly 2 in 5 people under 30 saying they're either struggling to make ends meet or getting by with limited security. That's according to a survey of 2,096 adults aged 18 to 29 conducted by Harvard's Institute of Politics between March 14th and 25th of 2025. The survey found that among that age group, financial insecurity most affected women, Hispanics, and those without college degrees. The likelihood of struggling financially drops for different levels of education, the survey found. So 50% of those not in college and without a degree, 35% of current college students, and 29% of college graduates. So it's worth noting that college graduates tend to be in a stronger position than young adults who are still in school, since they're more likely to work full-time in roles that offer higher pay. Yes, okay, obviously. But again, this just goes to show that a lot of younger people under the age of 30 are struggling. They're struggling financially right now. So, and then let's keep going. Big banks show consumers remain resilient heading into tariff turmoil. So consumer sentiment has fallen since Trump's Liberation Day announcement. So consumer spending rose in the first quarter despite rising concerns about tariffs and the economy, per Bank of America and Citigroup. Bank executives say consumer spending has held up even after President Trump escalated tariff threats. Bank of America's profit rose 11% to $7.4 billion in the first quarter, with revenue up 6%, driven by markets and wealth management. So Americans say they're getting worried about the economy and inflation, but banks say they aren't acting like it yet. So we're seeing this kind of dichotomy here forming, because we've got these headlines on consumer sentiment and consumer confidence, plunging and going down, basically saying that, the consumer is souring on the economy and they're terrified of tariffs and inflation and everything else. And it's hard for them to get by. And so there's evidence of that, but there's also evidence here that we're seeing that, like, hey, okay, they're concerned, but the spending is still really good. And the spending it's not only good, but I mean, on big ticket items, the spending is surging, which is fascinating here. And then we get this final piece. I'm going to show you one other thing here, which is credit card companies brace for a downturn. So Americans are still spending, but firms are putting away money to cover potential losses and tightening lending. Now, I've been talking for a while about, the rise in delinquencies amongst credit cards. And, so this is a pattern that's been going on for a little bit here. It's not unusual. So credit card companies are bracing for potential economic downturn and increasing reserves to cover expected future losses. Delinquencies are rising and are in line with levels from before the pandemic. Some firms are tightening lending or targeting affluent clients. AMX sees steady performance among high-income consumers. So it's an interesting here. And then I want to show you this final thing here. And if we could go in here, let's see here. This is really interesting. And maybe if I could blow this up for a second here to make this a little bit bigger for everyone to see. So this disconnect between what consumers have been saying and doing suggests that consumer sentiment surveys on their own have become weaker indicators of future consumer behavior and the health of the U.S. consumers. So, so again, this is really interesting here. So, so again, the University of Michigan expected change in prices during the next 5 to 10 years. So you have this big expectation here, but then you have 5-year ahead inflation expectation, median 5-year ahead expectation inflation. So they're expecting inflation to go down. US dollar inflation swap forward, again, not really, and then if we go to Nick Timir, I should never say this guy's name right. Nick Timir Eos. But Nick is a great writer for the Wall Street Journal. He has written a lot of great stuff. He actually wrote, I think he was the author of the book $1 billion Trillion Dollar Triage. That's a book I got to cover because it's a really good book. But anyway, so what Nick says here is that the Fed study, what consumers have been saying differs from what they have been doing during the post-pandemic period. Consumers say they feel worse, but through the end of 2024, they are buying more, not just spending more than they did in 2019. This disconnect between what consumers have been saying and doing suggests that consumer sentiment surveys on their own have become weaker indicators of future consumer behavior and of the health of the U.S. consumer. In contrast with much of the history of consumer sentiment measures since the 1960s, but similar to the history of consumer sentiment during other inflationary episodes, consumer sentiment in 2024 was more closely related to concerns about higher prices than to concerns about lower income. So it's just a very interesting thing right now that we're seeing this whole notion play out of different, this whole notion of the consumer sentiment going down, but yet we're still seeing strong spending. And yet at the same time, we have, consumers under 30 saying that they're struggling financially. And we have the credit card companies saying we're bracing for higher delinquency and we're putting more loan loss reserves aside to cover that. So very interesting to look at this right now. So in other words, should we be concerned with the polling and the surveying that we're getting out of these consumer surveys, this consumer sentiment? Are these things accurate? I've spent a long time over the last few months calling into question like the accuracy of the GDP numbers, the accuracy of the job numbers. I felt like a lot of these numbers were heavily massaged or even manipulated over the last few years. And now I'm beginning to question, is there something going on here with consumer sentiment? Are people worried, but maybe not that bad? And yet the survey showing this, like, people, consumer sentiment is tanking. So again, I think it's a fair question to ask at this point. And we're not going to have any answers. We'll have to, just see what, we'll just have to see what transpires there. So, okay, with that, I am going to wrap it up here this week because I know we're already going on 2 hours here. So, and sorry, I don't usually go this long, but I just, being off the week, I had a lot to go. There was an insane, I could seriously go for another 2 hours. I have just so much information to get to. I just don't have enough time. Maybe I need to start doing more live streams. Like maybe I need to start, doing more episodes during the week. I don't know. We'll see. Okay. So let's get to a couple of things I like to do at the end of the show. I like to do our story of the week and then our quote of the week. So, let's get into that. So the story of the week, we've covered a bunch of stuff so far, like the stock market crash in 1929. We've covered Black Tuesday, 1929, Black Thursday, the bank panic in 1907, and so on and so forth. So now we're going to cover the Securities Act of 1933. So the Securities Act of 1933 was created and passed into law to protect investors after the stock market crash of 1929. The legislation had two main goals: to ensure more transparency in financial statements so investors could make informed decisions about investments, and to establish laws against misrepresentation and fraudulent activities in the securities markets. The law required all prospective securities issued to register with the SEC and assemble a registration statement and prospectus. Today, they are made available to the public on the SEC's website and must include information describing the company's properties and business, the security being offered, its executive management, and financial statements that have been certified by independent accountants. So That Securities Act of 1933 was a monumental piece of legislation, dramatically changed the securities business and how it operates. And it had ramifications for trading, for IPOs, for it, just all kinds of things. But it was a great piece of, actually, one of the few times you could say, I think it was a great piece of legislation. It was a really good thing. It, over time, gave people a lot more confidence in the companies that they were investing in, because companies were forced to disclose a lot more about their balance sheet, their income statement, how they make money, how they do things, and that's important. Transparency is critical to the to a healthy functioning economy and investing markets. Got to have transparency. Okay, so now let's go to our quote of the week. So this comes to you from Thomas Jefferson. So nothing can stop the man with the right mental attitude from achieving his goal. Nothing on earth can help the man with the wrong mental attitude. And that was from Thomas Jefferson. Great quote. But with that, I will wrap up by basically saying I really thank everybody for watching tonight. Please make sure to share, subscribe. Watch a bunch of episodes. I got a lot of content on the channel, so please check that out. But definitely share, definitely subscribe, as that really helps the channel. Remember, like I said, Monday through Friday, I always have new episodes coming out. I'm working on a lot of different things right now. I got book reviews, working on a financial history series. I might have something really cool coming up in June. I don't want to release the details of that just yet, but I will over the next month. Like I said, I think something that people will really like and will really think is awesome in the beginning of June. But more information on that to come. And but with that, I'll just say, hey, have a tremendous weekend. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see everybody here again. We'll be back next week. And be safe. Have a great week out there. I'll see everyone again soon. Thanks a lot.